All right, guys, welcome to the Buff Show. Today we have Andrew Jolly with Joda Home Inspections here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome. So, Andrew is a home inspector. I've known you for a few years now. Can you give us a little bit background, like who you are, a little bit about yourself, how long you've been doing it, what got you into it?
Yeah. My name is Andrew. I am from Utah. I live in South Jordan. I have two kids, Josephine and Danny. That's actually who my business is named after, Joda.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. People sometimes think it's just a word I made up, but Josephine and Danny. I got into inspecting during the recession. I used to maintain foreclosures, and I would inspect for banks.
Okay.
And I would train other inspectors in other states on how to do these real specific inspections on foreclosures. And then once the recession was over, I started inspecting for buyers. Now I've been inspecting for buyers for about 7 years.
That's awesome.
So,
Yeah.
like a lot of people in Utah, I like to take advantage of a lot of the outdoor recreation that we have. So I like to camp and ski and
Travel, just got back from Hawaii.
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
I like to travel.
No, that's awesome. How many home inspections do you do a year? Because you're you're an owner operator. You're the owner and out in the field.
Yep. So when you call me, I'm always the one that comes out to inspect. I do between 300 and 400 inspections a year.
That's crazy.
So it's
Yeah. That's so many. That's awesome, though. So we're going to jump into this. If you're watching this, you're likely a buyer who just got a house under contract. You probably have a due diligence deadline, and you're like, well, frick, what do I do next? Or you're somebody looking at, getting a house under contract. So we want to break down that process for you and just put forth like everything that we know about that side of the business to make it simpler and easier for you. So typically how it goes, you get a house under contract, and then it's like, I always talk to my clients, I'm like, so at this point, you're in your due diligence phase, and we have like a broad list of questions, or it's a due diligence form that we have all the buyers sign, just like saying, here's everything that we recommend you look into during due diligence. And there's a lot of things in there. And one of the biggest ones I always recommend is a home inspection, and that's what you do. So can you go over, like, if somebody calls you and they're like, hey, can you do a home inspection for me? What does that general home inspection process look like? And we'll just kind of dive into it from there.
Sure. So when somebody calls me, first, kind of some info on what the home inspector does. A home inspector will go through the property and give you a very detailed idea on the condition of the home and all the major systems.
Mm-hmm.
I go through the structure, the foundation, the roof, the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC system. I give you ages of all the major appliances like the furnace, the water heater, tell you what's functional, what's not functional, what are some safety hazards, and then also a lot of more detailed items as well. Doors that are binding, windows that don't open the right way, things like that.
So it's like a very thorough process. How long are you in most homes for?
2.5 to 3 hours for the inspection, and then I will invite the buyer at the end, and we go over everything together.
Yeah. Do like a walkthrough with them.
I put it all in perspective, tell them what's a bigger issue, what's a smaller issue, what needs to be addressed sooner than later, and then I send a report the following morning with everything that we talked about.
Yeah, and the reports are like, even if you couldn't make it to that walkthrough, just getting that report. I mean, they're how many pages? 50 pages? 50 plus?
Yeah. It's digital, and so I don't always know how many pages, but it's probably 50, 60 pages, and it has color photos of everything.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool. Like, it's line item, like, hey, this is urgent. Like, I can't remember exactly how it's broken down, but
It has little symbols that represent different things: major defect, safety hazard, repair, replace, maintain.
Yeah. So anytime I have like a buyer that's under contract, before we do the home inspection, I'm always warning them, like, look, you're hiring a professional that all he does is look at houses all day long to go through and like pick out all the defects of the house. So like, be prepared to be like not as in love with the house like after that second visit. Do you see that a lot? Like buyers, when you meet with them and you're like, hey, here's 50 items that are wrong with your house.
Definitely. I try to put things in perspective. So every house is going to have things that could be better. Even new construction, I'll find some things that are blatantly wrong, but also just a lot of recommendations on maintenance and making things better.
Yeah.
And so I like to put it in perspective after we go through everything and say, you know, these are things that are not common. This is a big expense. This is a big safety hazard. And so I like to put it in perspective so they know it's not just a big list that needs to be addressed tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. Well, and there's never a perfect home. That's what I always tell buyers, like even new construction. Like I've had you do numerous new construction homes, and it's still like you'll come out with this big long list.
Yeah.
Like one I can think of recently, you found in the bathroom, the tile guys laid over a heat register and didn't cut the tile out. Like, and that was one of the things, like if like me or the buyer walking through the house, we wouldn't have probably seen that. you know?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that as a home inspector I do, and I have a process so that I check everything.
Right.
And so one of the tools that I use is infrared, and that's probably how I caught the missing vent. I go through with infrared and I can see hot and cold spots. And so as part of the process, I go through, and as I'm running the furnace, I will check for vents everywhere that they should be. And using infrared, I could even see where it was covered.
Right. Yeah. And so we ended up getting that, like, hey, builder, this is not cut out. And they went up there and found it. But like that easily could have been like just overlooked.
Yeah.
And then
And then it's drafty and they don't realize why.
Right.
And
Yeah. So the services you offer, you have the general home inspection, which I always recommend, and then there's additional add-ons. But let's dive into like the general inspection. You mentioned you check like basically the whole house, all the components and stuff like that, the furnace, the AC, the plumbing, the electrical. It's like it's a good overview of the condition of the home. What do you have like a price range you normally see that within? I know it depends on square footage, but
So people can expect to pay on average between $300 and $500 for the general inspection, and it's based on size and age.
okay.
And so it starts at around $300 and goes up based on size and age. Bigger
Okay.
homes take more time. There's more to look at. Same with older homes.
Yeah. And that's covering, and that includes the infrared and stuff like that.
And so the general inspection is all the major systems: the foundation, the roof, electrical, plumbing,
Yeah.
HVAC. I include infrared with all my inspections.
No, that's awesome. A key thing to keep in mind, like you're not a professional in every one of these trades. So like if it needs a new furnace, you're not going to be like, well, here's exactly what's wrong with the furnace or something like that. Like you're going to recommend them to a qualified HVAC professional.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm a generalist, and so I
Yeah.
go through. I know a lot about all the systems.
Yeah.
I don't know everything about individual systems, and so I'll find things that are wrong, and then I'll recommend the buyer talk to specific specialists who can fix it, and also give you a cost to repair it.
Right.
One thing to point out is that I don't give associated costs with each item.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's a dangerous move. Because you're not the one fixing it. So
exactly.
It's like,
And there's some things that I see often, and I see a lot of quotes for, like water heater replacements. There's some things that I will throw out numbers for because I'm comfortable, and I've seen so many of those things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are very specific to the house itself that you would want a contractor to give you a price for,
Right.
specific to your house.
Yeah. What are some of the additional add-ons? Like you have the general inspection, and I always recommend that one. But while you're out there, I know you've done like sewer scopes, meth testing, radon. So maybe let's break each one of those down.
Sure. So I'll kind of list them out first, then I'll go through them. You can test for radon. You can do a meth test. You can do a sewer scope. You can do a mold test. First, I'll talk about radon. The EPA says that radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer. It's a gas that comes up naturally from the ground. Everywhere has radon. It's just a matter of how high it is.
Yeah.
And so we can test it. I put in a monitor. It has to sit for at least 48 hours.
Okay.
And then it gives us a result with an average reading. And if it's too high, then it's recommended that you mitigate it. It's around $1,500 or so based on the
Yeah.
house to mitigate it. And then you can bring it down to a safe level.
Yeah. And it's kind of cool, those systems. Like they'll drill a hole into the foundation floor, and they'll put in like it's like an air pump, and it just circulates the air and keeps it circulating and moving. Because like you said, everywhere has radon,
Right.
like just a natural air. But
Right.
some areas, like if it's just creeping up through the foundation, through the cracks and stuff, you can be living in a house that has really, toxic radon levels,
Yeah.
and not even know.
And there's a lot of misconceptions about radon. Some people think that only houses with basements can have high levels of radon. And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily
I
true.
thought that for a while, like, oh, if it's slab on grade, don't worry about it, or 2-story, but that's not true.
Some people think that only old houses have high levels of radon, and that's not necessarily true. In fact, some new homes can actually be higher because they're so airtight, it can hold it in.
Yeah, no, that's true. And even if it has a system in there, it's not a bad idea to retest it and make sure it's operating correctly. Because don't they recommend every 2 years, I think?
EPA recommends every 2 years retesting.
Okay. Do you have, like, if you were to throw out a number, like, out of all the radon tests you do, how many are above and how many are below?
The EPA says it's about 1 in 3 houses in Utah test above the limit.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's pretty on par with what I see.
Is it?
Some states, it's as low as 1 in 10. Utah has higher levels on average than a lot of other states.
Gotcha.
So definitely something worth testing for.
Yeah, and radon's nice. Like typically, if it's found, it's fairly easy to remediate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, typically, you can go back to the sellers and say, "Hey, we found radon," and they'll work with you on fixing it. Not all the time, but
Sure.
typically.
Next item, meth testing. So if meth has ever been smoked or cooked in the house, it can be a health concern. Also, if you go to sell it later and someone else tests for it and finds it, if it's high enough, the state can require that you decontaminate it.
So this is methamphetamine.
Right.
I always I'll say, hey, these are the things like general inspection, meth, radon. They're like meth, and it takes people a minute to register. What's is that common here?
It's more common than I think people realize.
Yeah.
I know KSL did an article, and they said about 1 in 8 homes will have positive readings of meth, and I think that's probably accurate.
Yeah. So
somewhere around there.
I had Ann Atkins with Meth Mob. She does remediation, and she said national average is 1 in 10, but Utah's even higher than that. We're like third or fourth highest users in the nation for methamphetamine.
And if meth has been smoked in a house once or twice, it'll leave traces.
Yeah.
High enough that it should be decontaminated.
Just on one or two times, basically.
Yeah, I tested a house one time when they were purchasing it. There was no detectable levels, and then the homeowner called me back. She'd been gone, and her boyfriend had admitted that he had smoked meth in the house. So she had me come back because they had kids, and she was concerned. I went back and tested, and it was 13 micrograms.
Oh my gosh.
From a weekend.
That is insane.
And the state limit is 1 microgram. And so 13 times the state limit from a weekend.
Wow. That's unreal. Yeah, and I run into it a lot. Like every year, I seem to run into that. And we have another episode that's solely on meth decontamination. But a few things to keep in mind. It's odorless, and you can't see it. So it's not like you can judge a house.
No. And it's another thing I'll point out is that you can't really look at the homeowners and get an idea. A lot of people, when I offer the test, they'll say, well, I don't think there's any way that these homeowners are using meth, and it's never a reflection of them. One of the most common houses that will have meth are houses with people that have lived there for decades. And it's not necessarily the homeowners, it's guests that they've allowed to live there that might have used in their house.
Yeah, you can't judge a house by its cover. And yeah, I've seen that time and time again, houses that you would never think in a million years. And that's exactly what Ann said. She's like, a lot of these, say you have a really nice house up on the hill, and it's a $2 million house, and they have somebody that comes and stays with them because they're in a position to do so, and they're helping people out.
Exactly.
And little do they know they're down in their room, you know, doing drugs or something
Yeah.
like that's very common here. And so I think instead of inheriting the problem, because what do you charge for a meth test?
I charge $125 for a meth test, and then they have an option to rush it.
Yeah.
The lab charges $35, and we can get it back a lot sooner.
Yeah. So I mean, $125, and you could have that peace of mind, because 1 in 8 is pretty good odds that it's
Yeah.
going to come back positive.
Yeah, and the cost to decontaminate it can be thousands, and so
Well, and what people don't realize is it's not only the cost to decontaminate it, because they basically scrub every square inch of the house, but you got to rip out carpet, blinds, like anything that's like even this textured
anything
stuff.
porous.
Yeah, you'd have to rip it out, ceiling tiles. And so it's like, it's not only the cost on like remediation, it's like putting the house back together.
And when they spray this chemical on the walls to neutralize the meth, it isn't going to look the same after, and so then you need to repaint.
Bubbly.
Exactly.
Yeah. We had one in the Ogden area. It was this year, spring of this year, and we came back positive with meth. We had it decontaminated, and when they washed it, a lot of the chemicals went onto the floor. And these are like everyday household chemicals. Like it's nothing that you wouldn't find in a store, but they like soak the house, and a lot of the liquids come down to the floor, and they had hardwoods, and it like stayed on the floor for a little bit too long, and it actually bubbled and bubbled the hardwoods.
It's a lot of moisture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, you'll have a really clean house. Like I've done remodels and flips on houses that have had meth. So I don't want you guys, if the house has meth, it doesn't make it a bad house. It doesn't, like, you can still fix it. It's similar to like a new roof. Like, okay, it's got meth. What can we do to move forward to fix it? Because there's definitely different strategies. And if you run into this, we have a whole nother episode on the process of remediation and stuff. But sometimes it can be as simple as like decontaminating certain rooms or the ductwork, and it can be more simple than like the whole house. So So the third one.
Next thing would be sewer scopes.
Okay.
That's where I put a camera down the sewer line and record it where it's buried. A lot of people don't always realize that the sewer lateral line is the homeowner's responsibility until it hits the shared city line. And so even if it goes out into the middle of the road, that line is a homeowner's responsibility, and also any costs associated with that repair.
Yeah.
And so when I'm doing a sewer scope, I look at the grade. One of the most important parts of the sewer line is that it has good grade. If the waste and the water is not flowing on its own with gravity, it can sit there and create a blockage, and then it can back up.
Yeah.
You can get roots in the line, and that's a maintenance item. And so if I find roots, I would recommend, there's a couple different ways to have it cleaned.
Yeah.
Generally, I recommend hydrojetting, and that's where they blast out all the roots and make it nice and clean again.
Yeah. So what are some of the most common things? I know you said roots, which I actually have a rental that had roots in it. And just like a week ago, actually, Drain Tech called, and they're like, hey, it's time for your annual root maintenance, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
roots are fairly common. They come in through the joints, and they can allow waste to get stuck. So that's a common item. Bad grade, where lines are either flat, where waste doesn't flow out on its own, or have bellies.
So this building, because Andrew inspected this building when we bought it, and this building had, I can't remember how long, but it had not necessarily a belly, but it was definitely a flatter line, and just something that we need to watch out for. I was less concerned here because we just have 4 bathrooms. And it's not like people are living here and stuff like that, but hopefully, like, you never know. There was one house that we were going to buy as a rental, and you did a sewer scope on it, and it had like a really bad belly in it for like most of the distance. And I was like, nope, I'm not touching that.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's a good point. And that's why you get a home inspection and add these things so that you know what you're purchasing, and you don't purchase something that you're not prepared or able to handle.
Yeah. So, and then there's also, I've been learning more about the material. You have like concrete and cast iron. Those are probably 2 of the more common ones. And
clay.
Yeah. So let's go dive through those, because there's like an Orangeburg one.
Yeah. So Orangeburg, They didn't use it in a lot of areas, but Orangeburg was a lot like cardboard. And over time, this material, just holding water through it for decades, would get very soft and it would just flatten like a pancake. I don't see a lot of it. I've found it, but it's not a good type of pipe to have.
Yeah. So if you run into that, it's like, and it's I don't know, they probably did that 50 years ago.
I know Kearns had a lot of Orangeburg. It's
Really?
one of the most common spots to find Orangeburg was Kearns. And they were having so many problems with it that about 10 years ago, the city dedicated a bunch of money and they would send out crews and they replaced a lot of it for the homeowners.
Wow, that's crazy. I think I've ran into it in Logan before, but we basically were like, the homeowners or the new buyers were like, hey, like this is something that you're gonna have to fix or repair probably during your ownership, and so just beware.
Yeah.
What about new construction? Like, would you do it on new construction?
I recommend scopes on new construction, not because you're going to find things like roots, but you want to make sure that everything on the line is connected the way that it should be and that it has good grade. I have found, there's one house where they built a house and they're called cleanouts. And so you have access points outside so that you can stick down a camera or you can stick down a jetter to clean the line. And they must not have had the cap on the clean out because when they landscaped the yard, they put a bunch of dirt and rocks down the clean out. And so when I scoped it, I immediately hit a bunch of rocks and gravel, and that they would have moved in and had a backup pretty soon. Yeah.
Dang. And so it was probably letting like all the water go through, but once you got solids in there, it would have been backed up.
That's
really
the thing
fast.
is that had they not done a scope, all the water that I was running was getting through the rocks. But as soon as you put waste down the line and flush some toilets, it would have gotten stuck.
So, we recently, I think you did this house. It was a Layton house, and it was a new construction house, and you sent your camera down the line, and for the majority of it was good, but they tore down the old house and built it on the lot. And remember, they connected like a new line to an old line out there.
Yeah.
And we ended up being able to work out a deal with those guys because that old line was still on their property, and the builder didn't want to run it all the way out to the street, and so they just connected onto it. So it was like, it was new but old. You know?
Yeah. I've seen areas where they develop land, but they might not build houses for decades. And so they'll build a house, just like you mentioned, on a new lot, but they attach to an old line that's been stubbed out.
Yeah. So on that rock one where the rocks were down there, did they have to dig it out and like cut a line? Do you know how they fixed that?
I don't know how that one ended up going. I mean, hopefully they were able to jet out the rocks. They were big enough that they weren't going down with just water. But I think since they had fallen down the clean out, they were hopefully small enough that they could move them with some pressure.
Right, yeah, and get them out. Another story about sewer lines. There was a house I was selling up in Smithfield. I was representing the sellers, and before closing, like the line just got clogged up. I can't remember if it was before or right after, but like right near the end of the deal, the line got clogged up, and this house was built in like 2017. So it was like new. The buyers never did a sewer scope, but turns out like sure enough, there was like a break in the line and it had collapsed. And it could have been from like equipment driving over it, or when they were backfilling, like a big rock hit it and cracked it. And then over time it just started breaking. Another one I think you see a lot is when they do the backfill and where the lateral connects to the house. Like if that settles, it can rip that off.
That's called an offset, where the pipes slip and move away from each other.
Yeah.
Even on somewhat newer construction, for a long time they were using these rubber boots called Fernco's. And that's an area that's more prone to move because it's just rubber.
Right.
And so a lot of times it'll snap that boot, and then waste is going to come down and hit the lip of the next pipe and create a blockage.
Yeah. So again, what does a sewer scope cost?
I charge $200 for a sewer scope.
Okay.
Sometimes I need to remove a toilet, and that can add to the expense a little bit. But $200 for a scope.
And it gets you a pretty clear picture on what's going on.
Yeah, and I record it and I also narrate it. And so even if the buyer's not there while I'm doing the scope, they'll still be able to see the video and see exactly what I saw.
Yeah.
And then I'm narrating it as I pull it back, and so they understand what they're looking at on the video.
Well, and then if there's issues, you can send it to the sellers.
Exactly.
You can send it to a contractor that could fix it. Like it just gives everybody that clear vision or peace of mind
Exactly.
of what's going on down there. So if somebody has an issue with a sewer line, I know there's a few solutions. Isn't there a program with like Dominion where you can add like some insurance on it or something?
Yeah, there's different insurance companies. Home Service, one of the most common.
Yeah.
You pay X amount per month. It's not incredibly expensive. I think it's around $10 a month
That's
for
what
the sewer.
I thought. Yeah.
Another $10 a month for the water service line that brings the water in.
Mm-hmm.
And that can have its own separate kind of issues. But for $10 a month, you can get this insurance, and that way, if you have a backup or a big issue, it'll help offset the cost to have it repaired.
Right. No, that's awesome. And then let's hop on to some other items that might come up. What about like mold, lead-based paint, asbestos? Can you do any of that testing, or do you have somebody you recommend for that?
So I do. There's a couple options on testing for mold, and that's something that I do. You can do an indoor air quality test. And so if you have musty odors or if the cellar disclosed some sort of a flood or a leak in the past, I might recommend an indoor air quality test. And that's where I have a pump that pulls air through a canister and it takes a sample of the air. It kind of, all the air comes through and sticks to this piece of tape, any particles in the air.
Gotcha.
And then that gets sent to a lab, and the lab will analyze it and tell us what's in the air, whether there's mold. And I'll take a sample inside in a couple areas and then one outside, and we compare the amount of mold outside with what's inside. And if it's much higher inside, you know that there's an issue that needs to be addressed.
No, that's really cool. I have not done a lot with mold, but recently ran into an experience where, like a normal house, because typically I was always under the impression mold is something you can smell, you can see, and like it's pretty obvious when it's there. But that's not always the case.
Not always, right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is more obvious, but not always.
Yeah. So now I'm like, just get the mold test if you're concerned about it.
And that's some buyers are much more prone to health issues from mold than others. And so a lot of those people have experienced that in their life, and so it's a good idea.
Yeah.
If you know that's an issue to just test for it.
Yeah. If you have a concern about it, it's always better to just be safe than sorry.
Lead-based paint, that's not something that I test. I have the capability of doing a scrape test where I send some paint to a lab, but I think it's more cost-effective to have an environmental specialist come in, and they use this special tool called an XRF gun, and they scan the wall all throughout the house and window frames and trim work, and they can tell you where there's lead-based paint and where there's not. It's not invasive. It's not taking any physical sample, but it's using, I think, X-ray in this gun to analyze whether there's lead-based paint or not.
No, that's cool.
And that's a lot more cost-effective for the buyer. And so with lead-based paint, if it's intact and it's or even better encapsulated by other paint on the wall, not so much of a concern if it's not becoming airborne. But if they're doing any sort of construction or they have plans to do construction, it's good to be aware of it.
Yeah.
If you have wood-framed windows where you're opening the windows and it's kind of sanding away the paint, it's important to know whether that's lead-based paint so that you're not opening those windows and creating airborne dust of lead.
But a lot of these older homes, like I think anything older than 1978, you have to disclose that it could have lead-based paint.
They used lead-based paint in homes until 78, and then they could still use up what they had, and so even homes in the early 80s could have lead-based paint.
Right. But for health-wise, if it's just intact on the wall, covered up with other layers of paint, it's not necessarily, like, it's pretty safe there. It's until you start disturbing it, or like if you're trying to eat the wall or something like that. That's what you want to avoid.
Yeah, if you have kids especially that might be more prone to
scratching
things, biting things, or even playing in the dirt right outside the house. That's another concern where if it's an older home, it's good to keep in mind not to let your kids go out and dig right next to the house where they might have done construction or sanded off paint where it could affect them.
So what about asbestos?
Asbestos, same thing. I have the capability to send small samples to a lab, but I think it's best to hire an environmental specialist to come in. There's a handful of things that are very common to have asbestos, And so I'll try to point those out during the walkthrough so that they're not disturbing those areas and making it become airborne.
Yeah.
There's like tape that they used to use on ductwork. It's called transite tape.
Yeah.
It's like a white tape, kind of brittle looking. That is prone to have asbestos.
Popcorn ceiling tiles.
Popcorn ceilings.
Yeah.
The old 9x9 tiles. Not only the tile, but the black mastic glue that they would use to.
Oh, yeah, on the floor.
And so if it's intact and looks great, great. If you have loose tiles, it might be worth having an environmental specialist come in and take care of it so it's not kicking up dust.
Yeah. And I think on the outside, there's even like exterior siding tiles that they used to use that would have it.
Cement fiber tiles, a lot of those had asbestos.
What about, like I ran into a deal this year, and my buyer was a insulation contractor, and he saw that there was vermiculite insulation. I didn't even know what that was.
Yeah. If you've ever seen potting soil and you see the little foam beads, that's vermiculite. The vermiculite in your potting soil doesn't have asbestos, but there was insulation that they got from one mine, and it was from a company called Zonolite. And Zonolite vermiculite had asbestos. And so a lot of times I'll be in an attic, homes built in the 1920s will oftentimes have vermiculite, and it's all throughout the attic. And so that can be a concern. You don't want to be storing things in those attics. You don't want to have duct work going through the attic where it's going to suck it through your vents and circulate it in your house.
Yeah, because he was researching costs on like having it all sucked out and new insulation pumped in. Because it was like the sellers were like, well, just don't touch it. It's no big deal. But they're like, well, we want to add candle lights. We want to do this. Like, if we want to move walls. Like, we're going to have to like address that issue sooner or later. And it was like very expensive because it's not just like you can just hire somebody to come in and suck out the attic. No. It's got to be the environmental specialist. And like just to take that stuff and take it somewhere to be like dumped, like you have to go to a special place. Like the process can be very expensive.
Yeah. You don't want to try to tackle something like that on your own because if you're kicking up that dust, it doesn't just settle a few days later. It can get kicked up in the future. And so you want to make sure somebody's doing it the right way.
Yeah. So those are like some of the main things that I see people like test and look for. Is there anything else that you can think of that I missed?
Those are the main items.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to go through with you is if you're looking at buying a house, like if we can educate buyers on like things to look for, because a lot of people, they just get so in love with the house. And that's what I always try to do when I'm walking through. I'm like, well, look at the furnace, or like, especially homes built in like the year 2000 and it's 2022. Like, realize the average life expectancy of a roof is 20 to 25 years. The furnace, same thing. Water heater's probably been replaced one time, but it's like on its second leg of the second one. Like windows, siding, like a dangerous house to buy right now if you're not mentally prepared or financially prepared is like a house built in like the early 2000s.
Yeah, those houses that are 20 to 25 years old, if they have the original roof, original furnace, original AC, those are big expenses that are at their expected life. Houses built a little before that in the 90s or in the 80s, a lot of them have this gray pipe called polybutylene. That was part of a big class action lawsuit, so that's something to watch out for.
What about galvanized plumbing, like throughout?
Yeah, so even before the 1970s, you can have galvanized plumbing, and that's a steel pipe that will get rust and corrosion that builds up. And you'll eventually get to where you have very low flow. There's not really a fix for it other than replacing those pipes. And so that's something to definitely watch out for on a little bit older homes. Electrical, it's
knob and tube or aluminum.
Yeah, knob and tube, aluminum, and ungrounded circuits. Those are the three, I think, bigger concerns that you can have.
Yeah.
They would use aluminum wiring in the 60s and the 70s, and it's a fire hazard. Aluminum will expand and contract, and you can get loose connections, and so it's best that you not have aluminum. It can be a little harder to see as a buyer walking through, but it's something to be aware of and be prepared if you're looking at homes built in that time.
Yeah. And then there's the obvious stuff. Well, I guess foundation cracks is another one. If you see like brick homes are amazing because you can see exactly what's going on, but some of these like wood homes or like if it's got stucco on the outside, like it can be harder to tell, but like foundation stuff.
Foundation issues can be huge because they can be very costly to repair.
Mm-hmm.
Not every foundation crack is the end of the world. Generally, the rule of thumb is anything an 1/8 inch or smaller vertical crack is not necessarily a structural concern. Still something that should be addressed and sealed, monitored.
Mm-hmm.
But not every foundation crack is the end of the world.
Right.
There are some that I would definitely recommend foundation specialists look at and give you a price and a remedy for.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally on those ones in the due diligence period because they can be costly. So it's good to know whether they're able to address those items or whether it's something you'd be able to negotiate to have repaired.
Right. So just if you're a buyer, like keep in mind as you're walking through the homes, like you can kind of give yourself a rough estimate. Like most buyers have access to the seller's disclosures, which says when did they last replace the roof? And we know if it's a house built from like 2000 on, likely like it might not have a new roof.
Yeah.
And so if it's 2005 or 2010, realize that roof is now 12 years old. And what do you say average life expectancy on a roof? 20, 25 years?
Yeah. So for an architectural shingle, I would say 20 to 25 years in Utah. They don't use this as much anymore, but a 3-tab shingle, I would say has an expected life of 15 to 20 years, a little bit less because they're a little thinner.
Yeah. And then on the older homes, you'll run into things where like it needed a new roof and they're like, hey, roofers, come over and let's throw some new shingles on it. And they just lay them up over top.
Yeah.
Why don't you want to do that?
A couple things. Biggest thing is it'll hold more heat, and so it doesn't last quite as long. When you have 2 layers, it'll only last about 80% of its life.
Wow.
If you have more than 2 layers, that's simply not allowed because of the weight.
Right.
You don't want to add that much weight to your home structure. It's not rated for it. When you have multiple layers, it's not always flashed the way that it should be, and so water can run where it shouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
That's a concern. Last thing I would say is when you have multiple layers, the next time you replace a roof, it's going to cost more.
Right.
Because you're not just stripping 1 layer off, you're stripping 2 or more, and that's going to add to the expense.
Yeah. And I've seen homes with 3-4 layers on top, which is crazy.
Yeah. On even older homes, a lot of times they will shingle over wood shake. You should never shingle over wood shake because it's not a proper roof deck.
Yeah.
And so that's going to have even more expense where they're stripping shingles and then shake and then putting all new plywood down.
Yeah. Well, and we did that. We did a flip in Bountiful, and that house, it didn't have wood shake, but it had just like the 1x6 boards.
Skip decking.
Yeah. And like we ripped the shingles off, found that, and we're like, shiz, like this needs all new plywood.
Yeah, yeah.
So we had to pull all those off, plywood over top.
Yeah. And if you don't take those steps, it can void the manufacturer's warranty.
Yeah. So like those are things, if you're buying a house and like it's going to need a new roof in 5 years and you don't realize that like it's got skip decking and you're going to have to not only shingle it, but like put all plywood on it and everything, like that's a very big job.
Yeah. And it's something that you wouldn't necessarily see walking through.
Right.
And so it's good to have a home inspector that specializes in inspecting to go through because we have processes to check all those things.
Well, and you're not perfect. Like you're not going to catch every issue there is to be seen in the house.
I'm there, for 2 to 3 hours. And so I'm looking for major, I'm looking at all the major systems. And so I report on a lot, but it's not to predict the future. And it's not to report on, cosmetic items.
Right.
It's to focus on the most important things.
Well, and there's things sometimes you can't, like in the wintertime, you can't see the roof.
Yeah.
Like, you can see the attic, but you're not going to go walk on like the roof when there's a foot of snow on it.
Definitely.
Or if somebody has like a big couch or like a room full of boxes, like you're not going to unpack the whole room and like check it all out. So that like your inspection abilities are limited to like the house and like some crawl spaces, like there's like that much space. Like you're not going to army crawl throughout the whole basement and like, check everything out, but you'll do your best to see what can be seen.
Yeah, I do my best for the buyer, but there's certainly things that I can't report on what I can't see.
Right. But that's where like the infrared gun and like all these other things like come into play, and can be a huge like resource and added benefit. Another thing that we kind of skipped over, termites.
Sure. A lot of people think that that we don't have termites in Utah, but that's not true.
Yeah.
We don't have as big of an issue as a lot of other states, but we certainly can have termites. I will find termite damage a couple times a month.
Mm-hmm.
It's generally evidence of termites and not active issues.
Mm-hmm.
When I find termite damage, I recommend talking to a specialist and putting in a plan to have them treated.
Right.
Sometimes even just proactively, so that so you're certain that there's not going to be ongoing damage.
Mm-hmm.
I am thinking of an older home. I think it was built in 1910 or around there,
Mm-hmm.
and they had extensive termite damage throughout their crawl space, structural damage, and I don't think the buyers ended up moving forward with that house because
It's like rebuilding.
it would have been rebuilt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's bizarre. I've run into it a lot too, and I've had multiple houses treated. A lot of it, like what I didn't realize is the colonies, like they actually like will move around quite a bit, and so you'll see like existing signs of termite damage, and it can be like you can see it in the sheetrock. Like a lot of the termites like to eat it's like a cardboard paper film, but beneath the paint and then like the sheetrock layer. So like you'll start to see like indents and like weird things there. That happened on one of our rentals where some tenants were like, the wall is like changing, like, and they could see it looked weird. It almost looked like water damage in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But when we had somebody go out there and look at it, they're like, no, this is like, you have active termites right now.
They'll
And
tunnel.
Yeah. And so they were tunneling around. We caught that one early. We had it treated, and how that looks is they drill down all around the perimeter of the house, and they'll like pump fluid down into those holes. And a lot of these companies will guarantee it for like 10 years.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. When I find damage, I always recommend first consulting with the seller, because sometimes they are aware of a past issue, and so they can provide some sort of a warranty from a contractor.
Yeah. And so maybe it was already done or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So termites, that's another one. And we should do an episode just on that, because that would be a good one, because it is common. And when you run into it, you're like, oh no, like the house is going to fall over. But that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Most times it's just like you see it in a few places. They came and went. Like we had it in our sheetrock and maybe a few boards, but it didn't the house isn't going to tip over because of it,
Yeah, not necessarily. Yeah. A couple of things you can do to help prevent termites in your own homes. Not storing firewood right next to the building, and also keeping vegetation trimmed off the house as best as possible. That way you're not creating a pathway for these wood-destroying organisms to reach your house.
Right. Yeah, because they like you're having like wood right by your house is like having like some snack food. Like,
Exactly.
Hey, come on over.
Exactly.
You're baiting them in.
Yeah.
So that's very good point there. I think we've covered like most of the inspection process. So if somebody wants to work with you, like how does that look? They call you, email, like what's the best way? How do you prefer it goes if they want to?
Call or text is the best way to reach me.
Okay.
I'm usually pretty quick to respond. I ask for the address, and that way I can look up a couple details about the house, and then I send a price and my availability, and get the buyer on the schedule.
So typically, how many days should they be booking in advance? Like,
as soon as they're under contract, it's best that they give me a call. That way we can get them on the schedule and get the home inspected while they're still within their due diligence period.
Yeah.
And that way they can also have ideally a couple days, or, the more days the better, to look over the report while they're still in their due diligence time.
Yeah. Well, and if they're doing meth test or radon or some of these other ones, like those ones take a few days to get stuff back. So my experience with you is you're typically a few days, like half a week out.
Yeah.
And so like if we can get on the schedule sooner than later, typical due diligence period is about 2 weeks. So if you get on your schedule, as soon as you get under contract, you come 3 days later, and then you do all the stuff, and then 3 or 4 days later, you have everything back and you're
Yep.
still within that first week. And then the next week you're processing and like figuring out, negotiating whatever needs to be done during that period.
Exactly. And sometimes you might have an issue that you need to bring a specialist in. Like we talked about, maybe foundation issues. You might need to have somebody come in and give you a cost that's
Right.
associated with the repair.
Yeah. I would say more often than not. There's always like, and I would also say every home seems to have like one like big thing that's hard to get over, like one big fish in the room that you're just like, whoa, this is concerning. It could be a roof, furnace,
Sure.
foundation, like, and so just be prepared. Like you're gonna have a bunch of littler things, and then typically there's one or two like larger things that you have to really like come up with a plan or strategy to work around it and figure out how that works into the deal.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. One thing I want to touch on is once you have the report, there's a couple things to work through. First, is this a house that you still want to buy? Is this a house that you feel comfortable with? Next, you can take the report and you can negotiate with the seller, either to get things repaired or maybe to get some money as a concession at closing so that you can repair it on your own and make
Right.
sure it's done right. And last is just to take the report and have a list of things that need to be addressed or that you can work on later, a prioritized list that you're aware of that you can use down the road.
It's the honeydew list.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wives love it.
Uh-huh.
They're like, honey, we're going to be here for a
Yeah.
while. So each year I want you to start, going down this list. So what's the craziest thing you've seen during a home inspection, or maybe like a few
Sure.
moments?
I've seen a lot of interesting things. Some things are defects, homeowners that have made repairs themselves, using duct tape to wrap around drain lines to help prevent leaks, which doesn't seem to last very long.
Right.
I have found bats in attics. One funny thing that I saw, I was in this house and their whole living room was set up for their pet rabbit.
Yeah.
And so they had like a little fence around it and all kinds of things for their rabbit to crawl on.
That is
I thought
funny.
that was funny.
Well, and that brings up another good point. I had a house under contract last year with some buyers. I think you did the inspection too. You opened up the heat registers and they were rusted out.
Oh,
Like that they had cats or dogs or something that was like urinating so much in the vents that
Yeah.
it like rusted the ductwork out.
yeah. Pet urine is really acidic, and so it'll eat through that metal. And then exactly that. And another thing that I'll see is sometimes duct work will be ran through a slab. And so, especially if pets are urinating into those, when those ducts that are underground are used, it'll kick up a lot of dust.
Oh man. Yeah. So like and that's a whole nother like thing that we could talk about is like pets and like the damage they can cause. My clients ended up backing out of that house because there was so much like pet urine like in the floors and the ducts. Like they were gonna have to pull up all the flooring because you can't just like there's no way to get rid of it other than like ripping up like pulling because it's already like soaked in the wood, and you could try and cover it, but like that smell could still seep through. So.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at a house that's been recently remodeled and they didn't address the odors. It's very unfortunate because it should have been done while they were doing the remodel with, special treatments and special primers that'll help a lot with it.
Right. Yeah. So I guess moral of the story is there's a million things. Like first step is finding the house. Once you get it under contract is like, how much is this house going to cost me to own? Like what are some of the big ticket items? And that's why you need a home inspector. Like I've done a lot of flips and remodels and I still have you come look at my stuff.
Yeah. It's an objective person to look.
Right.
When you're the one buying the home, you see it in a different way and you're thinking about how it's going to feel to live in it, or, as an investor, you're thinking about, how much it's going to cash flow, and it makes it a little easier to overlook as the one purchasing it. So it's good to have somebody objective that's their job to come through and look, and they're not going to be clouded by, how pretty the kitchen is.
Yeah, it's the emotions. You take the emotions out of it.
Yeah.
So, Well, this has been amazing. One other thing I want to throw out there is it's always cool when you're working with somebody that like they're in real estate, like that's what they do. And I can tell that's what you do. Like you've been in the business long enough. I've seen you do your work. Like you do a great job. And not only that, like you own real estate, like you have your house and then you have rentals and you fixed them up. So like, that's cool. Like I'm the same way. Like we eat, breathe and sleep this stuff.
Yeah, I really love real estate. I like it as my career, going into different homes and helping buyers. Like you said, I have some investment properties and I love that part of it. But even when the parade of homes comes around, I love going to the parade of homes and seeing the newest and best and coolest houses and the new features. And I really enjoy it.
No, that's cool. Just can't get enough of looking at homes. Probably when you're laying in bed, you're just like scrolling through
HGTV, like all kinds of stuff.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. Where can people find out more about you or connect with you? Or?
Sure. I have a website, jodahomeinspections.com. I have an Instagram. It's more personal, but I'm happy for you to reach out there.
Awesome. And hop on the website. You can email him, text him, get with us. And he's a great person to have on your team during the transaction.
Thanks for having me. This was a good time.
Yeah, thank you.